this is Ignatian, aka Savage Armadillo Giraffe, coming at you with another part of the Dark Device special. Today we're gonna be talking about the mill mechanic. Alright, the mill mechanic, in my honest opinion, had an expectations versus reality type situation. In my honest opinion, I felt like the expectation was decking your opponent out, but the reality of it was basically being reversed great nature. And here's what I mean by this. So great nature has a self mill mechanic. And great nature has this thing where they mill the top card of their own deck, and depending on what the card is, it basically gets a certain effect. So if it's a normal unit, you get if it's a normal unit, you get a decent effect, but if it's a trigger unit, you basically get a way better effect. A prime example of this is activating Leopold. So if Leopold mills a normal unit, he looks at the top four cards of your deck, and you get to call up the two rear guards as long as they're not grade 3. The second ability, if you mill a trigger unit, you get plus 15k and a critical. Now basically I think this is Bushiroad's way of saying because you milled a trigger unit, you get a way better effect because that's one less trigger out your deck, which is completely understandable. I understand why Bushiroad did it, so I can't necessarily fault them for that too much. But then you have Great Nate. I mean, not Great Nation. Then you have Mega Colony with the mill mechanic, and it's the complete opposite. You normally get an effect, and you mill the top card of your opponent's deck, and you only get an extra effect if the card that you milled wasn't a grade 0. Um, However, I think this is basically Bushiroad's way of saying, yo, um you milled one of your opponent's triggers out of their deck. That's one less trigger out their deck, which basically means you plus enough. And I a little bit understand, but I kind of felt like that there should have been more, in my honest opinion. Like, not just effect wise, but milling wise in general. Because my thing is this: when Mega Colony was announced that they were getting their own mill mechanic, I was actually excited because of a couple of reasons. One, we get an ability that no other clan has. This is the first of its kind in the game that's been around at that particular time 8 or 9 years. The game's been around 8 or 9 years, and we haven't really had a quote unquote mill mechanic in the game. I think the closest to a deck milling your opponent was Narakami. I think it was Eradicators. I'm not too sure. I have to look that up again. But I do remember there was a couple of cards in Eradicators that. No, wait, was it Eradicators? It was something. It was something in the OG era Vanguard that allowed you to put the top card. I think it was something about your opponent like mills a card or they draw a card or something like that. I don't know. It was weird. It was a weird card. Nobody really used it like that, but still. Anyway, we get our own mill mechanic, and the second one is at this particular time, Mega Colony didn't really have a quote unquote identity in standard format. Now, it was going to be kind of sort of like Tachikaze in when you look at the standard and the premium version, where the old school Tachikaze was all about engorging, and the newer version of Tachikaze is all about equip gauges. A little bit understandable. And I was like, okay, well, Mega Colony, I guess their old mechanic is going to be about stunning your opponent's vanguard and rear guards. And then, you know, I mean, not the standard, the premium version is going to be all about stunning your opponent's vanguard and rear guards. And Then you have the mill mechanic that is basically going to be about milling your opponent in standard format. I was completely fine with that. I don't know about a lot of other Mechaniconic players, but I was definitely fine with that. I do remember seeing some things where they were like kind of excited about it and everything else like that, but I was cool with it for a while. But then we got the support. I'm not going to say it was disappointing, but the expectations was really high compared to the reality of the situation. So from all of the cards that we got mill wise, we got Gun and Colio, we got what else was it? We got Gun and Colio, Hiding Killer Leaf, Cycloma Tooth, and we got Brony Jerk. We only got 4 cards that milled out of the 25 cards we got in that set. I think it was 25 cards. Anyway, we got 4 cards that basically milled. So, to quickly talk about their effects, Gun and Colio on place mills the top card of your opponent's deck. If that card, as long as it's not a grade 3, you get an extra drive. But if it's a grade 3 or greater, you get quad drive and you get another 15k to the thing. The second ability is you Soul Blast a grade 3. Your opponent mills a top card of their deck, and whatever grade that card is, they can't guard with that grade in hand. Okay, pretty interesting. But then you had um Cycloma Tooth, that its mill ability was on attack, counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, your opponent mills a top card of their deck, and he gets a critical if it's a grade 1 or greater. Regardless of if it's a grade 1 or greater or a 0, he still gets 10k. Then you had Hiding Killer Leaf that was kind of similar, but instead of the built-in critical, you got a draw, which was understandable. Last but not least, you have Brony Jerk, where Brony Jerk was a Soul Blast 1. Your opponent mills a top card of their deck, and if it's a grade 1 or greater, you get the Soul Charge, which was understandable. I felt like Brony Jerk's other ability, the one that forces you and your opponent to discard one, was actually a little bit more, productive. But that mill mechanic still like stands. Anyway, so when you add everything together, so let's see, you do one Soul Blast from Brony Jerk, one Soul Blast from Gun and Colio. You do one Soul Blast each from both Hiding Killer Leaf and Cycloma Tooth. So that's 4 Soul Blasts if you were to use every single card in one particular turn. But then you have 2 Counter Blasts, 1 Counter Blast of Hiding Killer Leaf, 1 Counter Blast of Cycloma Tooth, and now you have a total of 4 Soul Blasts, 2 Counter Blasts, only to get, let's say, 5 cards out of your opponent. 5 cards that you're able to do this. 7 if you were to play 2 more Brony Jerks. But then that basically means that becomes a Soul Blast 6, which means you Soul Blast 6 cards, you Counter Blast 2 to get a full experience of milling your opponent 7 cards. But at the end of the day, there's no way in hell you're going to be able to have 6 Soul Blasts pretty easily, even though there are cards that allows you to get to that particular state. But still, that's way too much of a high cost to only, force your opponent to mill 5. Keep in mind that 2 of these cards are on place cards. Now, here's the thing. If I had to choose, if I had to choose what, in my honest opinion, the perfect number of cards to mill your opponent without it being busted, without it being broken, I felt like 7 cards would have been worth it. Like if you were to mill your opponent 7 cards, 7 to 9 cards a turn, that would have been worth it. It would have been worth playing the deck, or it would have been worth um playing mill, and it would have been not completely busted. It would have been useful, but at the same time, balanced. In my honest opinion, I'm not saying that we should have been like, oh yeah, every single turn mill 10, 20 cards. No, that shouldn't necessarily be a thing. I feel like that should have been the end result if the game lasted too long. Like, you know how there's some clans that it gets a lot more powerful if the game lasted too long. Like, for a prime example, like Neo Nectar, like, you notice like the attacks get a lot stronger if the game lasts longer than it should. And I kind of feel like that should have been like the middle mechanic. Like, it will start off like around 5 to 7, and then as the game goes on, if the game is still continuing, you'll start milling like maybe one more card than you did last turn or anything else like that. I kind of feel like that should have been a thing, but we never got it, so it's poof. But then again, we did get two cards out of the Dragon Aeon AX. I think I'm saying that wrong. Set 10. Let me just call it set 10. We got two cards out of set 10. And it was Turbulence and Dust Speed. Turbulence is a counterblast one, mill the top card of your opponent's deck. And depending on that card's grade, you dish out cradle markers to units that doesn't have cradle markers on your opponent's side of the field. It's an okay effect. It's a counterblast effect, so it kind of sort of clashes with Ghidorah, so it's okay. As far as being in Gun and Colio, the only thing that makes it clash with him is the fact that it's a grade 1. That's the only thing that makes it clash with it. But outside of that, it's okay. But then you have, let's say, the second one, which is Dust Speed, which in my honest opinion is the best mill mechanic out of everybody right now. Because what he does is counterblast one on the plays. Your opponent mills two cards, and if any of those cards or both of those cards are grade 1 or greater, you just have to hit one grade 1 or greater card. You're like, when he attacks, your opponent has to dish out two cards in their hand instead of one. Now, the only bad thing is he doesn't get a boost from it, so you basically have to make him hit some type of numbers. But I guess it's understandable because he's milling two cards instead of one. So when you put all of that into consideration, where originally it was 5 cards for 4 Soul Blasts and 2 Counter Blasts, now you're adding 8 cards for 4 Counter Blasts and 4 Counter Blasts and 4 Soul Blasts. However, you also got to remember that because we don't have extra markers, that means the conflict between Hiding Killer Leaf, Cycloma Tooth, and Dust Speed is definitely going to play a thing. So that basically means that if you were really to do any of this, um, Cycloma Tooth and Hiding Killer Leaf will be in the front, and you'll just play Dust Speed in the back and probably replace him with like Brony Jerk or something like that. Now, 8 cards per turn isn't really that bad, but again, you also got to remember that there has to be ways for you to get the Soul Blast, and you also got to remember that Gun and Colio Soul Blast is a grade 3, which I'm gonna be real with you. I'm gonna talk about this whole Soul Blast grade 3 thing for a second. If we were to take just Raging Tactics and High End Destructive War alone, this becomes an issue for one particular reason. Remember, at this particular time, our finisher was Antlion. And Antlion requires you to discard 2 cards in Soul Blast 1 grade 3. That basically means that you had to find a way in a timely fashion, in a timely manner, to get two grade 3 cards into the soul and have Antlion and Phantom Black, and also have a freshly new Gunning Colio in your hand, that became a huge issue. This became so much of a huge issue. I actually took Antlion out due to the simple fact that there was no way at that particular time in that meta, Hyuga meta, where I was able to get two grade threes into the soul before by my first grade three turn. Like, there was no way in hell I was able to do that. But I had to make it happen. And the only thing that I did at that particular point, especially during Char Expo 2019, was I made it to where what was it? I made it to where I was focusing on Gunning Colio and Phantom Black being the new Antlion Phantom Black combo. And it kind of worked and it kind of didn't. I'm gonna be real with you on that. It was legitimately hit or miss, but the main thing that I was missing was, at least with Phantom Black and Antlion, you were able to prevent your opponent from using Sentinels. With Antlion and with Gunning Colio and Phantom Black, yes, you get the pressure because your opponent can only cover grade zeros. But you also gotta remember that they can still use Sentinels. So even if you were to get those built-in crits, it wouldn't matter at the end of the day. And your only saving grace was if Gunning Colio's ability, second ability was when they milled a grade zero. That was like your only thing. It was like, oh, Gunning Colio milled a grade zero. You use Phantom Black. You use Gunning Colio, and now your opponent just can't guard at all. They have to intercept or die. And the issue was, this was cool until you played against a protect deck where they still have a Sentinel in hand. So that's when it became a huge issue. Luckily, because it was XL format, I hardly ran into a protect deck outside of an Angel Feather player, but it was whatever. So, if I was to take this whole section of the clan and revamp it and redo it, what would I do? Okay, so I really wouldn't change much. I kind of feel like that I would have focused more on decking your opponent out instead of attacking offensively. And here's what I mean by this. Um, I play different card games. I play Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, Pokemon, whatever. And whenever they have a mill mechanic, it's not an aggressive deck. It's never an aggressive deck because all of their focus is based around decking your opponent out. For a prime example, Yu-Gi-Oh had a card called Needleworm, ironically an insect, but basically when you flip Needleworm face up, your opponent mills the top 5 cards of their deck. That's actually pretty good because it's a card that has to be used defensively and have no offensive purpose whatsoever. Now, am I saying that Mega Colony shouldn't have had a purpose offensively? Not necessarily. I do feel like that the pressure between forcing your opponent to discard cards, not discard, to mill cards, and the pressure to attack your opponent with decent amount of attack definitely should have been there. But if I had to choose which focus to put on everything more, it's definitely the mill mechanic. Like I said, we should have been milling like maybe 7 to 9 cards per turn perfectly. Like that should have definitely been a thing. Most of our, in other words, most of the things should have been 1/3 milling, 1/3 recovering, and like a little bit like point 0.5 attacking and everything else like that. Forget that we don't really hit a lot of good numbers. I felt like at that time, because we weren't really hitting big numbers, the trade-off should have been the milling. The trade-off should have been the defense, having better defense. The trade-off should have been it should have been a lot of stuff. Like that the trade off should have been my defense is better than your offense. Like that definitely should have been what the trade off is, especially when at that particular time XL decks were, a huge thing. Force decks are still a somewhat threat because they have a higher attack in their on their vanguard and everything else like that. But man, I don't think I felt like the hand we were dealt wasn't powerful enough. I felt like the hand that we were dealt wasn't effective enough. And I felt like that definitely should have been a thing. And I also felt like it was a high risk, low reward part. Like I know it's supposed to be high risk, high reward, but I felt like the reward was very low because your only saving grace was Gunning Colio's second ability hitting a grade 0 and you having Antlion and Phantom Black on the field so that the thing becomes unblockable. Shouldn't have been a thing. Um, so, with all that being said, let's get to this deck list. Alright, so for the deck profile, you're going to notice that Venom Stinger and Intrude Scissors is in the deck. This is basically because that they work pretty well with the mill mechanic actually. And you're going to notice a lot of mill based things when I do my Venom Stinger deck profile. But yeah, outside of that, you're going to also notice that our trigger lineup is also going to be 4 heals, 6 draws, 6 criticals. I feel like that this is going to be like the case for all of my Mega Colony builds. I know it's not like the best thing to do, but I feel like that we're at a time where we do have to worry about defensive shields. And yeah, the criticals give 15k defensive shields though, but let's be real, the hand power isn't really there. Like I feel like that Mega Colony, it doesn't completely lack hand advantage, but like late game, that hand advantage is almost nowhere near to be found. Like you will have a very good hand early game, but run into one of those decks where they're hitting you for like 30k plus per attack, you're not really going to see much of a hand. And then you also got to remember that we're running a shit ton of grade 3s, which has no shield value whatsoever. So you can have like a 10 card hand and 8 of those be grade 3s, and that definitely becomes a problem. So that's why we're running 6 draws in our deck, so we can actually at least try to get something with shield value instead of having nothing but grade 3s, especially seeing that most of our deck is just gonna be doing nothing but filtering grade 3s. But anyway, grade 1 lineup, we're obviously running for high class Moth. That's basically going to be also a staple. This definitely works in the deck too because he's considered a grade 3 in the soul. So you can use Gunning Colio's second skill on your first grade 3 turn, which is something that I feel like Gunning Colio was definitely missing. So that's basically another reason besides the counter charge that we're running him, as a full playset. Next up we have 3 Brony Jerk. Brony Jerk is pretty interesting. So he not only mills, but he also grants you a soul charge if like the mill is a grade 1 or higher. But it's his second effect that I love. So basically when he boosts a unit that's attacking your opponent's vanguard, you get to discard a card, and before guard step your opponent has to discard a card as well. this definitely comes in handy late game. Like let's say you have like 2 or 3 more attacks to to attack your opponent with, and they have like 3 or less cards in hand. That definitely comes in handy because then it forces your opponent to like rethink of how they're going to be guarding everything, knowing that they're going to be forced to discard something. So that's another reason why we're playing him at 3. Outside of the mill deck, he's kind of sort of 50-50, but I would also have to say that this discard effect is also the reason why we're running 6 draws in the deck as well. So we'll at least have something to like discard without losing too much hand advantage. Not to mention that you could discard Intrude Scissors, so you're able to get him into the grave a lot faster because you already know that's like the best place for him to be. So there's that. Also to unfilter all those extra grade 3s in your hand as well. Next up, we're running 2 butterfly officers. Our obvious counter charger slash soul charger in a way. So we're definitely running 2 of her. Most builds I'm running like 2 to 3. I think this is one of the few ones that I'm running 2. And the only reason why I'm running 2 in this particular build is because I'm building this more as a toolbox, so I need to room for as much text as possible. Next up, we're running 2 Little Dorcas. He's our grade 3 searcher. Not much I can say about that. And we're running 1 Turbulent Signal, which you counterblast 1, retire this unit, and your opponent mills a top card of their deck, and depending on the grade of that card, you distribute that many cradle markers. If I remember correctly, he is a hard. Oh, he's not a hard once per turn. I forgot. It's the other one as a hard once per turn. We're only running 1. For a couple of reasons. One, you're going to go against certain decks that won't have rear guards for you to distribute cradle markers at all. So if you are able to use this card, you're more likely just going to use it for the mill effect. The second reason is because you can recover it with a high class moth, so you could get it back into the deck, which is actually pretty good. Which is also the reason why we're running 1 Morsi Roro at 1. You're not really distributing that many cradle markers outside of Turbulence. Well, actually, Turbulence is the only way you're distributing a cradle marker. But she's there just so you can use the combo of not only getting a card from your hand, but also getting a card onto the field. I think it's a pretty decent combo and together. But we're not really focusing that much on cradle markers, so that's why we're only running 1 and 1. This is kind of sort of why I say this is more of a toolbox deck than anything, because it does have cradle marker play, but it's not really focused. It's kind of more of a, if it's there type of ordeal. Next up for our grade 2s, we're running 4 Mega Lara Lancer. Mega Lara Lancer basically puts stuff into the soul. This is a pretty good tool to go against Narukami specifically, so they don't bind all of your Intrude Scissors. But at the same particular time, it's also a tool to get grade 3s into the soul a lot faster when you're on Venom Stinger. So that's a thing. Plus, he does force your opponent to, restricts your opponent from not intercepting at all, so that's another good thing. And plus, this card plus is very hard if you're going against XL decks, especially if they have a full field, because he gains 2k for each rested card on your opponent's side of the field. Trust me, those numbers definitely add up and they're worth it at times. Then we're running 4 Machining Mantis, your obvious grade 3 searcher, nothing to really talk about there. Last but not least, 1 Hiding Killer Leaf. It's weird. Even before the Clan Selection Volume 1 and the Dragon Aox set, Hiding Killer Leaf was always put to 1. It was either put to 1 or 2. And it's a little bit understandable because your grade 2 lineup isn't really like a huge focus, and he does have a very hefty cost. I mean, Counterblast, Soul Blast one for you to have like a 50% possibility of getting a draw. Now, if it was almost guaranteed for him to get the draw, it kind of would be a little bit more played. But like I said, he costs a Counterblast and a Soul Blast. That's pretty heavy when you really think about it. Especially if all you're only getting is one especially if all you're really getting is 1 mil out of a 2 thing cost. But yeah, that's just me. Last but not least, for our grade 3 lineup, we're running 3 Gunning Colio. He is a Vanguard only skill. Basically, on place, force your opponent to mill. It gains either triple drive or quad drive. It only gets the quad drive if it's a grade 3 or greater. And it only gets 5k if it's a triple drive, but 15k if it's a quad drive. And then the second ability is Soul Blast 1. Put the top card of your deck, of your opponent's deck, into the drop zone. Depending on that grade, your opponent cannot guard with cards from their hand with that grade whatsoever. So it's actually pretty good. Pretty good guard restrictor. Like I said, you're able to use that ability on your first grade 3 turn because of high class moth. Before, this was always a second grade 3 turn ability, which kind of sucked because that means you had to re-ride into another Gunning Colio, where now you can just use it all together. But anyway, moving on, we're running 2 Venom Stingers. Venom Stinger's ability you should already know. Force your opponent to put up to 2 cards in their damage zone, put it into the drop zone. They put the top 2 cards of their deck into the damage zone, and you basically perform drive check, and whatever triggers they get, you get instead. Basically communism triggers in a way. He's basically going to be our finisher. The original finisher was obviously Antlion, but now he's going to be our finisher. So you will grade 1. The first grade 3 turn, you'll go into Gunning Colio. The second grade 3 turn, you'll go into Venom Stinger. But if you go into Venom Stinger on your first grade 3 turn, it's not that bad either. Let's just hope that you have the Intrude Scissors to go into the grave. Next up, we have 2 Dust Speed, where in my honest opinion is the best like mill card at the moment, because he's on plays Counterblast 1, mill 2. If any of those 2 cards are grade 1 or higher, your opponent is forced to guard with 2 cards in their hand on attack. Now, if you have Intrude Scissors, that means that you can restand it and get another attack impossible. But the problem with this card is it doesn't gain any attack on its own, so you basically just have to fish out for those attacks. But the interesting thing about it is, as long as you're not going against force, you can just pretty much attack with base, and they're forced to either intercept or they're forced to guard with 2 cards in hand, or even forced to take an attack. And the more cards you force your opponent to waste for no apparent reason, the better. Or to force your opponent to take a damage. So if they're forced to take a damage, you're basically just going to get the Intrude Scissors alone off of that poke. So that's pretty interesting. Then we're running 3 Intrude Scissors. Originally I was running 2, but I do feel like that 3 is basically good. He's basically supposed to be your what is it? He's supposed to be basically your Hildemize, except for he could call himself from the grave at the end of your Vanguard attack, which is actually pretty balanced, but is actually pretty good at the same time. Let's be real, this card basically helped out Mega Colony a lot more than you think. Last but not least, we're running 1 Cyclomatooth. So, on attack, you Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, gain 10k. Put the top card of your opponent's deck into the drop zone, and if it's a grade 1 or greater, you get an extra critical. His second ability is pretty interesting. If it so happens you have to go that particular route, if you ride on top of him, your opponent is forced to discard a card, and your Vanguard gains 5k for each of that card that was discarded as grade. So, this strategy is pretty straightforward. Is it the best? Not necessarily, but we work with what we have to work with, and this is kind of sort of something I have to give a little bit credit for. If I really had to change anything, it would probably be like the whole turbulent signal one. Like maybe I should take out Morty Roro and put another turbulent signal, but there isn't that many cards that pops Cradle Markers too. If your opponent doesn't have any rear guards whatsoever, you're just using it just to force your opponent to mill the top card of the deck. That's basically all you're really using it for. But with that being said, this is the deck list that I have right now. Tune in on Saturday when I do the Gridora deck profile. But until then, my name is Mr. Z Nation, aka Savage Armor Jones and Rafa. This has been the Dark Device.